When she and her younger brother Alfonso were brought to the court of Enrique IV, they were shocked to see the immorality and the treachery that was going on at the Castilian court. The weak and profligate Enrique was a disgrace to his throne and a traitor to the white race. Archbishop Carollo of Toledo accused King Enrique as follows: "The abomination and corruption of sins so heinous that they are not fit to be named, for they corrupt the very atmosphere, and are foul blot upon human nature." The archbishop joined other discontented nobles at Burgos in drawing up a series of memorable accusations publicly addressed to the king. They declared that the king's Moorish guard and others to whom he had given power had raped married women and corrupted and violated virgins, and men and boys against nature. And good Christians who dared complain were publicly whipped. They charged that the king had destroyed the property of the Spanish laboring classes by allowing Moors and Jews to exploit them. That he had caused prices to rise unreasonably by debasing the currency. That he had allowed his officials to practice bribery and extortion on a huge scale. That he had made a mockery of justice and government by vicious appointments and by allowing hideous crimes to go unpunished. That he had corrupted the church by casting good bishops out of their sees, replacing them with hypocrites and politicians. To the credit of both Isabella and her brother, Prince Alfonso, it was generally agreed that they walked through this fetid atmosphere of that foul court without contamination, and emerged from it with a lifelong hatred of the prevalent immorality and of its causes, among which they reckoned the influence of Muslims and Jews. There were many intrigues at court, and revolutions and battle flaring up throughout the kingdom. Isabella's brother, Prince Alfonso, was first in line for the throne. However, when he was 15 years of age he died suddenly. Some accused King Enrique or his followers of poisoning him, but this is not certain. Isabella became a valuable political pawn and many intrigues were in progress to have her married to various political alliances. King Enrique attempted to marry off the princess as soon as possible to King Alfonso V of Portugal, who was anxious to obtain Isabella's consent. Another suitor at this time was the Duke of Cayenne, brother and heir apparent of King Louis I of France. Also determined and intent upon marrying her was a Jewish mulatto of unsavory reputation by the name of Don Pedro Gorn, who had obtained the king's consent. Fortunately, while this lecherous character was on his way, determined to marry Isabella against her will, he became desperately sick and died. Princess Isabella received the news of his death with tears of joy and gratitude and hastened to the chapel to give thanks to God. Having survived all these, when she was 18 years old she married Prince Fernando, the heir apparent to the throne of Aragon. Don Fernando was a manly youth almost a year younger than she. In their union loomed the prospect of uniting the great kingdoms of Castile and Aragon into one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Many enemies, including her half-brother, King Enrique, fought the prospect of such an alliance. Nevertheless, her marriage, which had been secret, when it became known, became an established fact which King Enrique was powerless to undo. Isabella's half-brother, King Enrique, died on December 12, 1474. Amid the joy and jubilation of her new subjects and amidst great pomp and ceremony, Isabella was crowned Queen of Castile on the 13th day of December that same year. She was then 23 years old, a beautiful and stately figure. Her husband, Prince Fernando, was not at her side at the time. When he learned the news of Enrique's death and of his wife's coronation, he was in Perpignan, where he had gone early in the autumn to save his father from capture by his enemies. The Queen and her husband had a strict understanding about their regal prerogatives. Queen Isabella was to be the sole and supreme ruler of the Kingdom of Castile, and when Fernando came to the throne he was to be in the same capacity over the Kingdom of Aragon. Many were the intrigues, the gossip, the controversies amongst their followers and enemies to divide the court into two factions, but they were not successful. Henceforth, in most public affairs, they were to act as one person, both signatures on all documents, both faces on all coins. Even if necessity parted them, love held their wills in unison. Many persons tried to divide them, but they were resolved not to disagree. They could not afford to have differences if they wished to accomplish the gigantic task that awaited them. To bring order out of anarchy, to restore the prestige of the crown, to recover from robber barons crown lands illegally granted them by Enrique, to deflate the currency and restore prosperity to the farms and industries, to settle the Jewish problem, the Moorish problem, The converse problem: this was a task that seemed impossible for a young woman and a young man with neither troops nor money. France and Portugal were their enemies. Castile was a state of chaos. The situation was amazingly parallel to that which faced that other great leader, Adolf Hitler, when he inherited a bankrupt, divided and broken Germany in 1933. He too had a divided country. He too had a nation that was divided within itself, a nation wrecked by the Jewish problem and faced with a multitude of enemies on the outside. Although she was unusually fortunate in having a husband that supported her totally in her endeavors, the driving force and the crusading zeal came mainly from Isabella herself. No sooner had Isabella been crowned Queen of Castile when the country was invaded by Alfonso V, King of Portugal. Fernando and Isabella inherited kingdoms that were without troops and without finances to acquire an army. However, Isabella's enemies had failed to reckon upon her awakening genius. For months she lived almost constantly on horseback, going from one end of the kingdom to the other, making speeches, holding conferences, holding court all morning to sentence a few thieves and murderers to be hanged, riding 100 miles or more, over cold mountain passes to plead with some lukewarm nobleman for 500 soldiers. Wherever she went she stirred into flame the ancient hatred of the Castilians for the Portuguese. While Fernando collected troops from the northern provinces, Isabella assembled several thousand men at Toledo and rode at their head, in full armor like Saint Joan, to meet her husband at Valladolid. By the end of June, 1475, they had assembled a motley host of 42,000 men, poorly equipped and badly disciplined, many of them farm hands and released convicts. Whipping them hastily into 35 battalions, Fernando left Valladolid in July, and struck southwest to the river Douro. After several months and several battles during which the fighting raged back and forth, Fernando finally put King Alfonso's forces to rout, thereby ending for the time being the threat from Portugal and King Alfonso V's claims to Isabella's throne of Castile. The victory over Portugal left Isabella undisputed mistress of Castile, but it was a Castile ridden with famine and pestilence, and economically almost beyond repair. No one paid their debts and there was no means of enforcing them to be paid. Disorder was the usual course of events. Peaceful men were not masters of their own property. They had no recourse to anybody for the robberies and the acts of violence they endured. The chief task that confronted Isabella and Fernando now was to restore respect for law. To do this, Isabella and her husband rode from town to town, sometimes together, sometimes separately, administering justice without delay and without cost to the people. The young queen would hear complaints, order reconciliations and restitutions, condemn the guilty to death, and ride on to the next place. Within a short time her justice had filled the country with consternation. It was the more terrifying because it was felt to be impartial and incorruptible. A great deal of the corruption was among the wealthy nobles themselves, and, as had been their practice formerly, they offered the queen enormous sums of money in order to bribe her from enforcing her strict justice. But the queen preferred justice to money. For instance, when a wealthy noble named Alvarennes, who had murdered a notary, offered the queen the enormous sum of 40,000 ducats if she would spare his life, she emphatically refused and had the head of Yanez struck off the same day. In order to avoid any suspicion of mercenary motives, she had the property distributed among his sons, although there was plenty of precedence in justifying her to have it confiscated. Isabella and Fernando were only too well aware of the fact that the Mohammedans, who occupied the southern half of Spain, were assembling forces to again invade and conquer the northern half of that divided country. They were also only too well aware that their own forces were scattered, divided, and pitifully weak to meet such an invasion. She knew that there were several other primary prerequisites that had to be corrected before the country could be unified enough to meet such an invasion. The church itself was thoroughly corrupted and staffed with converse Jews that were in key positions to spread anarchy and confusion during any stress or strain that developed. Her half-brother, King Enrique, had given away and forfeited so many crown lands that revenue was almost non-existent for shoring up the royal treasury. They, therefore, felt that two further necessary steps, harsh though they be, had to be taken in order to unite the country and enforce the supreme authority of the crown. Since the Catholic Church wielded tremendous power in Spain during the 15th century, The king and queen knew that they had to rid the church hierarchy of the deceitful and perfidious converse Jews who were now posing as Christians, but were ready to sell out the church and their country at the first given opportunity to the Mohammedans. They decided to institute the Inquisition, and once and for all cleanse the church of this alien group that was neither Spanish nor was it Christian. Isabella realized that before she could meet the threat of the Moors from the south, she had to overcome the enemies within her own country. Among these enemies she could count not only the Jews of the synagogue, but the secret Jews, the conversos, who had infiltrated the hierarchy of the church. She knew that it was the Jews who had invited the Mohammedans into the country in the first place, and who had always been considered enemies within the gate, sympathizing with, and often lending assistance to, the hated Moors. Having secured secretly from the Pope 2 years earlier permission to establish the Inquisition, she and Fernando now proceeded in earnest. The Jews had not only corrupted and contaminated the Catholic Church itself, but they had also originated and spread the Albigensian heresy. This heresy was teaching and practicing suicide on principle, and the followers frequently smothered or starved their sick, and even put infants to death. Here we see another idea and teaching originated and spread by the Jews that would tend to stifle and destroy the white race. It was to meet the questions raised by the Albigenses that the Inquisition was first established. The Inquisition itself never condemned anyone to death. The inquisitors would go to a certain city and summon all heretics to confess within a fixed time, usually within 30 days. Those who did so were treated leniently. A prisoner who was found guilty and refused to abjure was handed over by the inquisitors to the state, which then proceeded against him as a traitor. In practice, about 2 persons out of 100 accused were put to death. Some were imprisoned. Some were freed. Torture was used as a last resort, but efforts were made to restrict its use. In the meantime, it became quite evident that the Mohammedans were making a determined attempt to conquer all of Europe. In 1479, Mohammed II, the Grand Turk, advanced by sea to lay waste to the island of Rhodes. When in the next year of 1480 the Knights of St. John at Rhodes repulsed Mohammed II, the latter threw all of Europe into consternation by swooping down upon the shores of Italy. His crews ravaged the coast of Apulia, and on August 2, 1480, Mohammed took by storm the city of Otranto in the Kingdom of Naples. Of the 22,000 inhabitants, the barbarians bound 12,000 with ropes, and thus helpless, put them to death with terrible tortures. They slew all the priests in the city. On a hill outside the city, now known as Martyrs' Hill, they butchered many captives who refused to become Mohammedans, and threw their corpses to the dogs. The apathy of the Italian princes was incredible. Undermined and controlled by Jewish moneylenders, they remained disunited and completely impotent. For example, the King of Naples was at war with Florence, and his son Alfonso, the Duke of Calabria, was 150 leagues away in Tuscany fighting in the Tuscany War. And so it went. Panic began to sweep over the Spanish kingdoms. Men were asking what would happen if the Turks came from the east and the Moors of Granada took the offensive in the south against Andalusia. Castile was without a doubt on the eve of war, and it would be a war in which she would need every ounce of her strength. And yet there were secret enemies within her gates, enemies who had grown rich upon her wealth in the past and given evidence of their sympathy with the hated and feared Mohammedans. These enemies were the Jewish conversos in Castile, a nation within a nation.